The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.
What we have seen from his first administration, from his approach in general, he's not someone who cares about financial crime. And that's a real problem because fighting financial crime is complicated, it's difficult, it's technical, it's granular. And if you are not a details guy, and Trump, heaven knows, definitely not a details guy, then that's going to be difficult to achieve anything.
Welcome to The Laundry, a podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world. The Donald Trump sequel is happening, and this time it's personal.
We have taken back control of the Senate. Wow, that's good. And the Senate races in Montana, Nevada, Texas, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, were all won by the MAGA movement. They helped so much. Money makes the world go round.
The former US president has made his way back into the White House, despite all the controversies, court cases, provocative statements, riots, and more. But what does it mean to the financial crime space that we have the first convicted criminal to be elected to the Oval Office? I'm your host, Marit, CEO of Strise, and in this episode, we are asking, how will Trump's presidency impact financial crime and money laundering globally? We'll be discussing the role of the US in fighting financial crime standards globally, the dark money surrounding Trump, and what can we expect in the next 4 years. And to dive into this topic, I'm here with Oliver Bullough, the author of Butler to the World and Moneyland. Welcome back to The Laundry, Oliver.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's good to be back.
It's actually been a dream of mine to have you back for a long time, so I'm glad we finally made that happen because the episode I did with you is actually one of our most streamed ones ever. So yeah, glad to have you back.
I bet you say that to all the guests.
No, I don't. It's the truth. It's the truth. I have the numbers to back it up. But if there's anyone who don't know who you are, can you remind our listeners about you and your background?
So I'm a journalist from the UK. I started my career working in Russia back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I witnessed the arrival of Vladimir Putin into the Kremlin and then his sort of consolidation of power over his first term, second term, and so on. I started writing about financial crime more or less accidentally. I'd been writing about Russian politics, various sort of Russian social issues, the war in Chechnya and so on, but it became increasingly hard for me or impossible for me to write about those topics without writing about corruption. And then if you start writing about corruption in Russia, it doesn't take you very long to realize that you need to start writing about the role of the City of London, the role of places like Switzerland or the British Virgin Islands in moving the money for the Russian oligarchs. And then that takes you very quickly into the whole sort of underground world that I call Moneyland in my first book. And it's the gift that keeps on giving. It turns out that, just when you think you've managed to wrap up understanding how kleptocracy works, it turns out that, there's a whole other bit. You open a cupboard and it turns out not to be a cupboard at all, but a doorway to a whole new labyrinth. So yeah, it's an endlessly fascinating topic, how financial crime works, how money laundering works, how the offshore world works. And I'd like to think that, my next book will solve the problem, but I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic about that.
If it has an impact, at least that's positive. I feel at least that since we started this podcast 2.5 years ago, a lot of topics have actually made it into the general public. Like before the war in Ukraine, sanctions wasn't really on anyone's mind, or it wasn't in the general public in Norway at least. And now it's talked about and uncovering more things. So I at least feel the world has changed a bit in the last 2.5 years for the positive, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, there have been, obviously, you mentioned sanctions surrounding the war in Ukraine, which is a positive. Of course, the cloud around that silver lining is it took the war in Ukraine for that to happen. So,
of course,
you would hope that we might be able to prioritize tackling financial crime without, a kleptocratic thug launching the biggest land war in Europe since 1945 to achieve that. But, there we go. That's where we are.
And now there is this huge event in the US. The election is over and Donald Trump is back. But before we dive into the dark money surrounding him, I just want to start by getting your take on the role of the US in the fight against money laundering. So, how significant is the role the United States plays in the fight against money laundering and financial crime on a global scale?
Indispensable. The United States is the indispensable nation when it comes to tackling financial crime and money laundering. The United States invented anti-money laundering with the Bank Secrecy Act in 1970. The enforcement of that act, the first major enforcement of it in Florida in the early 1980s, was the first major anti-money laundering operation anywhere. And then, although the Financial Action Task Force, the sort of cornerstone of all international efforts against money laundering, was created at the G7 summit in Paris in 1989, it was very much pushed through with inspiration from the US, with a lot of ideas from the US. And then, of course, the only really major changes to its principles which have ever been brought in were brought in after the attacks of 9/11, 2001, and the sort of focus, the renewed focus on terrorist finance as well as on money laundering. So it is always the US that drives through these ideas, partly because of the role of the US as the sort of centerpiece of the Western political alliance, but I would say actually mainly simply because, the globalized financial economy runs on dollars. You can't do anything without dollars. And if you aren't bringing along the country that produces dollars with you, then obviously you're not going to achieve anything. Obviously a lot of dollars will move through offshore centers like London, but, the role of New York in clearing dollars is central. So without New York, you're not going to achieve a thing. When it comes to tackling money laundering, you can't do it without the United States. And that is, the reality of the modern fight against financial crime.
So it's both a tone from the top and the fact that they are the world's largest economy that comes into play in their role in that, I guess, then, if you were to sum it up. But if you think about the regulatory landscape, the US versus the EU, it isn't the same. So there has been some kind of diversion there as well. How do you look at that, like the regulatory aspect of it in Europe versus the US?
Yeah, I often thought that, if I could click my fingers and make something happen, I would bring in the enforcement role that the United States has alongside the transparency agenda that the EU has. That's obviously, slightly out of date. The various court challenges to the anti-money laundering directives in the EU has closed a number of their, corporate registers. I mean, obviously they're going to try and prise those back open, but the pushback has been real. And also, in the US, actually, there has been progress on corporate transparency. So it's not as quite as clear cut as it used to be, but still, I would say that the enforcement is far, far better in the US. They take it far more seriously. They resource it more. They have far more experience in the FBI in particular when it comes to tackling financial crime. And, however, the murkiness of corporate ownership in particular in the US is off the charts when you compare it to pretty much anywhere else on earth. And then, obviously on top of that, there is the role of the dollar. I think an issue that doesn't get nearly enough attention is the role of cash dollars as the sort of the basic building blocks of money laundering. The US produces an astonishing amount of cash dollars without anyone really paying it any attention. They're actually building a whole new factory to produce cash dollars, despite the fact that people in the US are using fewer and fewer cash dollars on a daily basis all the time. And yet the demand from outside the US, and let's face it, that's demand from criminals from outside the US, is so healthy that, they continue to produce them as fast as they can. So, the US remains very good, full marks or high marks on some things, enforcement, very, very poor marks on other things. Particularly its production of $100 bills and its corporate transparency, although there has been progress, remains pretty far behind the standards that you'd find elsewhere in the world.
There are some reforms now on corporate transparency, but what if we could wave a magic wand and then all of the ownership became transparent in the US, like it is in certain European countries tomorrow? What would the impact be?
Can you imagine? Wouldn't that be amazing? I mean, I think we're going to get on to the impact of, the Trump presidency and what it may mean and how it will impact different aspects. One of the interesting things about the US, as opposed to, I think, most European countries, is that corporate transparency is much more of a political issue in the US than it is here. I mean, the UK, for example, has had huge problems of its own with its company registry, very different problems caused much more by a lack of verified data than about a closed registry. But that has been, certainly major progress has been made in improving that. And, it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than it was. That just happened, right? That wasn't, there was no political discussion about it in particular. It was just something that hadn't been done, and because no one really could be bothered. And then it got done, and there we go, it's done. All right. But there's been no pushback or anything. In the US, there is a much more commitment by particularly wealthy Americans to being able to use, LLPs to hide their ownership of their assets, hide their ownership of property, to, minimize, using that word in the most expansive sense, their taxes that they have to pay. So what would be the impact on the world if the US opened up all its corporate registries? It would be primarily in the US, and it would be like a bomb going off, right? I mean, imagine the amount of people that would be scurrying around desperately trying to hide their assets if it was suddenly visible to the tax authorities of what they owned and how they owned it and so on. Imagine if all of the trusts in South Dakota, which own astonishing amounts going up all the time of assets being owned via trusts in South Dakota, if all of that was suddenly transparent, it would sort of unimaginable. I mean, it would radically change the structure of the economy in the US. And I don't know, I mean, would it cause a revolution? Probably not. But it would be pretty interesting. I'd like that to happen. Can we make that happen? Do you have that kind of power?
Love that. I would love for that to happen. Okay, from a journalistic perspective, if you were to speculate, the ownership registries are open, what would you think is the most interesting finding or shocking finding if you just had that information available? Just for the fun of speculation.
I mean, obviously there isn't, looking at it from, a perspective being outside the US, there has been, an increasing prevalence of foreign billionaires to put their money via US structures because of the various changes that have happened to the global financial system since 2007-8, and the Common Reporting Standard, which was brought in and which obliged countries to exchange information, all apart from the US. So that would be really interesting to be able to see what Chinese billionaires own, how they own it. Is there a big Russian presence in the US that we can't currently see, things like that. But the impact would be far, far more interesting in terms of exposing how US plutocrats own their wealth, how they structure it, how they've been minimizing taxes and so on. That would be where the real gold would be. I mean, it would be an endless trove. As journalists, you would never run out of things to write about. It would overwhelm. It would be like the Panama Papers times a billion. You would never run out of things to write about. I don't know, those Panama Papers things, it always has to begin with a P, doesn't it? So Paradise Papers, Panama Papers, whatever the other ones are. I mean, they're increasingly far-fetched. You need to come up with a P, Pasadena Papers and a Pennsylvania Papers, something like that, and then it'd be great. You could just keep working on it forever.
I really want this to happen now. I just got this deep motivation to continue doing this, just try to impact it in any way possible. But
I'm still stuck on the P, I'm afraid. I haven't come up with a P yet. Let's spend the rest of the podcast trying to come up with a good P.
Try to come up with what it should be called. Yeah. So we need to talk about Donald Trump, but before we go into him and the dark money surrounding him, just a quick question on just a specific one on the Biden administrations. What have you seen specifically the last 4 years that is encouraging or not encouraging, or the impact that administration has had on the fight against financial crime?
I think one of the problems with Joe Biden's White House was that it promised a lot when it came to particularly a lot of international issues, but delivered not very much. There was a lot of talk about encouraging democracy globally, a sort of summit of democracies. There was a lot of talk about making anti-corruption a core national security issue in the US and so on. But actually, in terms of what they were able to achieve, was relatively small. I think this is, going back, can be a problem with Democratic presidents in general. I mean, remember Barack Obama, said, I remember you were in his sort of acceptance speech saying, this is the moment when the sea level stops rising. It wasn't, as it turned out. They're quite good at this sort of messianic approach that now I've been elected, everything's going to be fine. And then actually, the world resists successfully. So, he said a lot of great stuff, not just in terms of tackling corruption, also in terms of, trying to reform the global tax system. And, if his ideas for changing global tax system had gone through as proposed, it would have been a transformative and extraordinary in terms of, really helping to prevent the big race to the bottom from big corporates being able to exploit places like Ireland or Jersey and so on to really minimize how much tax they pay. That didn't happen either. So, in a way, the results you could say were a bit disappointing from Biden. But he did set a very good tone. He helped to really push through very serious sanctions against the Russians, the Russian elite and the Russian state after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is really important. So that is good, and he deserves a lot of credit for that.
Remember, the United States pulled together a coalition of more than 50 nations to support Ukraine. We unified and expanded NATO. We can't walk away now. And that's what Putin is betting on. He's betting on we're going to walk away. That's why I'll be speaking to the G7 folks, so some of the heads of the European Union and NATO today. That's why I'm announcing more than 500 new sanctions in response.
But, as with many democratic administrations, you sort of end it thinking, well, if only all the stuff they'd said they were going to do, they'd actually been able to do, wouldn't that be wonderful? But sadly, that didn't happen.
Our overall goal at Strise? Eradicate financial crime. To achieve this, we know we have to build a network of expert partners to put together the ultimate package for compliance and AML teams globally. Let's hear what Plenitude, the leading independent consultancy in financial crime compliance, and one of our partners has to say.
The single biggest issue that are facing our clients in regulated firms at the moment is the increasing cost of compliance. Some of the pain points that clients are trying to address is that requirement to automate both AML and KYC controls. We've been working with Strise initially on a proof of concept exercise to test their solutions in the UK marketplace. But now we've formalised that partnership, and we're now in a position to obviously offer to our clients Strise solutions alongside advisory and implementation support as part of deployment of those solutions. One of the things that we really like about Strise and their solutions is it does enable our clients to realise the benefits of AI relatively quickly, and the implementation timelines are relatively short compared to other solutions.
Want to work together? Visit strise.ai and click Become a Partner to book a meeting. And on to the topic of Trump. He will be the 47th president of the United States of America. And what do you expect from him in terms of the fight against financial crime?
I mean, it's always a bit foolish, isn't it, trying to predict anything with Trump? I feel slightly like predicting with Trump is a little bit like trying to predict things with Vladimir Putin. I always get predictions with Putin wrong. In fact, I'm kind of almost like an opposite indicator. If I predict something, the opposite's going to happen. Trump is I don't know if mercurial is the word for such a sort of chunky individual, but, he's someone who can surprise everyone all the time. He seems to delight in it. So it's perfectly possible that he'll do something which will surprise everyone for all sorts of reasons. But, in terms of, I think, what we have seen from his first administration, from his approach in general, he's not someone who cares about financial crime. And that's a real problem because, fighting financial crime is complicated, it's difficult, it's technical, it's granular. And if you're not a details guy, and Trump, heaven knows, is definitely not a details guy, then that's going to be difficult to achieve anything. So it's difficult to imagine that any of that kind of presentation that came from the Biden White House about the importance of tackling kleptocracy as a national security issue, about the importance of reforming the international tax system, it's hard to see that any of that is going to happen under Trump. All of that will end. And that's a problem.
How much of this is linked to the dark money and vested interests that surround him? Is that influencing his financial crime fighting interests?
Yeah, I mean, that gets to the core of the issue, actually. Listen, I don't think that, say, Elon Musk, right, or Peter Thiel, or any of the big billionaire backers of the Trump campaign, I don't think that they're particularly enthusiastic about financial crime. I'd say probably on balance, if you ask them about it, they'd probably say they think it's a bad thing. They don't particularly like, I imagine, drug cartels or, kleptocrats or whatever. But they really hate financial transparency. Financial transparency is a major threat to their personal wealth. It's a major threat to the way they want to do business. It's a threat to their ownership of things and how they want to own things. So it is of far greater significance to them to derail a transparency agenda for the benefit of their businesses, their kind of businesses, than it is to tackle financial crime. And sadly, tackling tax avoidance, evasion, and tackling financial crime are kind of the same thing. You can't do one without the other. If you bring in the kind of financial transparency and enforcement mechanisms that will help tackle financial crime, you will inevitably also be tackling tax avoidance and evasion and the kind of tricks which are used to hide legitimate wealth as well as illegitimate wealth. So I think that is the problem that we have. It's not that these people are, on the payroll of Putin. I don't think they are. I mean, Putin couldn't afford them, for one thing. They're not on the payroll of, any of the cartels or whatever. It's just they don't care. They are far more interested in getting rich, in making sure their companies become as big as possible. And sadly, the side effect of that is that if you don't take financial transparency seriously, then you can't tackle financial crime. And that's a real problem.
On the topic of financial transparency, one of the biggest winners from the Trump victory is the crypto industry. You saw a big surge in the price of Bitcoin, etc. And there is a lot of dark money and money laundering in the crypto industry. How do you see this going forward in the fight against financial crime?
Yeah, this is one of the issues around Trump that I'm most concerned about. I'm not particularly persuaded at the moment that crypto is a useful tool for the kind of retail criminal. I think it's too expensive and clunky at the moment to use crypto to, say, buy cocaine on the street. Your dealer turns up and you just move some money from one wallet to another. I don't think that's happening much, just because it's annoying and expensive and all that. But the use of crypto, particularly the big cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin obviously, and others, as a way of essentially trade-based money laundering, as a way of transferring large amounts of value between countries or between individuals in a very hard to understand or trace way, is very real and very, very serious. Trade-based money laundering, which I think is probably the biggest, obviously, typology of money laundering when it comes to moving value around the world, is annoying. It's annoying to have to move value in the form of a shipment of cars from, China to Italy or whatever, rather than in the form of just a bank transfer from one bank to another. It takes ages and it's clunky and all that. If you can move that value outside the formal financial system in the form of just moving Bitcoin from one wallet to another, it's instantaneous. It's incredibly convenient. You can move, very large quantities of value just like that. It really takes all the difficulty and the problems out of trade-based money laundering. And trade-based money laundering unleashed, it's already a problem. It's already a massive problem. The idea of it being unleashed in the form of the crypto market, is essentially like taking the battle against money laundering back to the 1960s and 70s and just saying there are going to be no controls at all. And that is really, really, really alarming. I don't think that there is a useful, legitimate use for cryptocurrencies. To be honest, I'm not really persuaded that there is any meaningful, useful use for blockchain. I don't really see, it seems like a solution in desperate search for a problem, but there are a lot of people who own a lot of cryptocurrencies who want to see the value of those cryptocurrencies go up, and as purely as a speculative asset. And those people have poured huge amounts of money into the Trump campaign. They're going to get I'm sure they're going to get their reward as a result. And the concomitant effect of that is it makes it far easier to money launder.
Oh yes, guys. Welcome to yet another episode. And as you can see right now, we have some craziness going on, guys. We have some crazy stuff going on because finally we're out of the basement for real. This consolidation has pumped all the way to 80K. We've been consolidating, as you remember, since end of February here. And during the last week, this week of the election with the Trump pump that we're seeing right now, finally, guys, we're getting to eat. Finally, we're getting to the dinner table. We are getting the dividends paid out. We are getting the pump delivered right into your phone screen so you can see it when you wake up.
Again, I don't think they're doing it. I might be wrong, but I don't think these individuals are doing it because they want to launder money. I just think the problem is, as with tax dodging, they just don't care. They want to get rich. They have the opportunity to get rich, And if a load of other people are going to suffer, well, whatever, who cares? Crypto is a massive problem. It's one of the two, potentially really huge problems for me with the makeup of the Trump administration. Obviously, I don't know when you're going to be putting this out. We don't really know who's going to be filling any of those crucial roles in the Trump administration. And hey, look, he may surprise us. Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah, it's unpredictable.
Yeah, maybe not Elizabeth Warren. It'd be nice though, wouldn't it? Can you imagine? Imagine if Trump suddenly decided that actually he was going to go left wing. Oh.
In terms of predictions, I know you said like it is hard to predict, but if you were to give your predictions on sanctions the next 4 years, what do you think will happen?
Well, I'm not actually as doom-laden on sanctions as a lot of people are. Obviously, Trump is a bit of a Putin fanboy, and so sanctions with regard to Russia will presumably be up in the air, potentially. I'm not saying that that's necessarily going to happen. I mean, it's Trump. I mean, anything could happen, right? So often when we talk about sanctions, we only really talk about Russia. But actually, I think of far greater significance for global money laundering is the situation around China. The driver of, the provider of liquidity into sort of the global money laundering market is capital flight from China. Wealthy Chinese people who are looking to get their money out of China in defiance of the restrictions on capital movement imposed by the CCP. And, if Trump could do something to restrict that, or he starts taking seriously the issue around that capital flight, that could be transformative in terms of denying liquidity to the cartels and other criminal groups, which, they're currently finding it very easy to launder money simply because there's so much demand for their cash from wealthy Chinese people who want access to money outside China. So, that could be a big deal. I mean, I'm slightly at the edge of, dreaming here because, if there's anything we know from, Trump's business and the business of his family, it's that he's very welcoming of money from China. The EB-5 Golden Visa program has been a key source of investment for Trump businesses and the businesses of his family. And a lot of that money is clearly money that's come into the US evading capital restrictions from China. So it may well be that he doesn't care about money as long as there's money available. And so I may be completely wrong. But he has been very outspokenly hawkish on China when, to be honest, at a time when within the foreign policy establishment in the US, that wasn't so widespread. So perhaps he'll take Chinese money laundering seriously. To be honest, I'm clutching at straws here. I don't think that's likely to happen. I think he's far more likely just to welcome as much money as he can into the US to build more garish and revolting buildings that New York could really do without. But, it's possible that he would take that seriously, and that could be a good thing. So, in terms of the situation around Ukraine, I'm very worried. I've got many friends in Ukraine. I spend a lot of time in Ukraine, and, I despise Putin's structure of government. And I'm appalled disgusted by what he's done to Ukraine, and the idea that he would get away with that and be rewarded from it is a really alarming prospect. But, also the idea that Trump could somehow lead a Western coalition that would take the sort of infiltration of Chinese kleptocratic wealth into their sort of economies more seriously, that would be a good thing.
We're coming to an end of the show, but this election clearly has real world consequences. So do you think we should be worried? Yes or no?
Yes, I do. I think we should be worried for many reasons. But since we're talking particularly about financial crime, obviously there has been among some of Trump's political allies, a campaign against, the Corporate Transparency Act, which was passed at the very end of Trump's first term. There's been suggestions that should be unwound. Trump's connection to the sort of Project 2025 idea is pretty tenuous. He's not always entirely wedded to it. So who knows whether that will happen or not. But, the Corporate Transparency Act, although it's baby steps, is the first real progress the US has made towards proper corporate transparency. And, that is a worry. That would be something that would really set back efforts globally to bring a bit of light into the murkier reaches of the global economy. So yeah, along with crypto, that's a worry.
I think then the laundry, we're going to put that on top of our to-do list and our agenda to try to drive that forward with the little efforts, the effort that we can, even though we are just a small podcast in the grand scheme of things. But, that definitely came to the top of my attention list now after this talk. All right. Before we end this episode, we are going to dish out some quick fire questions for you. So I'll say a word or a sentence and you'll finish it or say the first thing that pops into your mind. Are you ready?
Born ready.
Finish the sentence. Trump's biggest impact on financial crime will be...
To ignore it.
Who benefits the most from a Trump victory when it comes to financial crime?
Crypto money launderers.
Are we going to see more sanctions under Trump or less?
More.
And finally, what gives you hope?
Can I do a more than a one-word answer to this? This is an interesting one.
You can.
If you go, going all the way back to, the discussions around the Bank Secrecy Act in the US, which was brought in 1970, but discussed in the late 60s, bringing in changes to money laundering legislation has always been framed with, but we really respect other countries. We don't mean anything rude about Switzerland. We love Switzerland, but, we're going to do some changes because of this money, and that's always been a problem because, to be honest, a lot of places don't deserve our respect. Places that are taking money from criminals and laundering it readily and making cash out of it, they don't deserve respect. They deserve to be criticized and ostracized. And occasionally that happens. It's what happened to Latvia, but it doesn't happen enough. London doesn't get called out enough by other countries for being, a sink of dirty money. And it really should be. One thing that Trump is really good at is just saying what he thinks. He doesn't respect anyone as far as I can tell. That isn't a good thing. But I think it had, during his first term, it did have the weirdly beneficial side effect of forcing European countries to take their defense more seriously and to start spending a bit more on defense. And if, and I appreciate this is a big if Trump was to start caring about some aspect of financial crime, I don't think he would be all respectful about the role of, Singapore or Switzerland in saying, oh, well, these are great nations and we need to respect their traditions. It'd just be like, no, we're going to start sanctions on them. So maybe that would be good. Maybe what we need is a bit less kind of respect for major money laundering sectors and a bit more just calling them out and slapping sanctions on them. I appreciate that that's a sort of desperate quest for a silver lining. But I do feel that, there's been too much kind of willingness to tolerate other countries' misdeeds when it comes to enabling financial crime. And, perhaps it would be good to have someone who doesn't care about showing countries that don't deserve respect. But, obviously that would come with, a very large side order of not showing respect to countries that do deserve respect. And so it would be mostly terrible. I don't know. I'm doing my best here.
I think it was really well put. When you said this, I actually got a little bit of hope and I started believing in that silver lining. So if I did it, I hope our listeners did it. And, who knows? Maybe this actually will happen. We can hope. That's good. That's always good. Fingers crossed.
Listen, there's so much more we could have talked about. We haven't talked about tariffs, which are always a problem because they open loopholes, and loopholes are where money launderers thrive. We haven't talked about possibly enough about China. But, I do think, we've given a lot of bad news. So maybe it was good to give a tiny bit of, potential good news, even if it's only potential.
It sounds like we need to do another episode on tariffs as well then. But with that brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Oliver, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find and connect with you?
I'm on the socials, LinkedIn, obviously. I do still have a Twitter account, but I'm not going to lie, I don't really use it anymore. Twitter's not what it used to be. But, if anyone wants to get in touch with me, I do check my DMs, so send me a message on that, Oliver Bullough, or, LinkedIn. Always keen to connect with good, interesting people in this space.
And thanks to everyone who is listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, go check out the back catalog and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. If you haven't heard the previous episode I did with Oliver, I highly recommend you to go check it out. We even did a respin of that over the summer. We'd also love for you to share the podcast on your social media channels, tell your colleagues about it, drop an episode in a group chat. It really helps people to find us. And if you got a story you think we should be talking about, you can comment on the Strise LinkedIn page, my LinkedIn page, or email us at laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Marit. Our producer was Matthew. Our engineers were Dominic and Nicholas. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you next time. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.